Good evening, and hello, Vesper. Go take your walk, and we'll be here when you get back. All right. So I started this chapter on Tuesday. Um, it's a very long chapter, so I'm going to finish it out tonight. That'll put us back on track. And as far as Tuesday goes, I had other stuff come up and I couldn't, or Wednesday I should say, I just had other stuff come up and I couldn't make the Star Wars reading. So here we go. So we left off at a break in a natural break in the chapter. So here we go. Jurisdiction in the French Revolution, the formula for loss of control. French planters, whether in the metropolis or in the colonies, were no less sensitive than Georgians or South Carolinians to the threat of governmental meddling with slavery. In 1789, however, their prospects could hardly have seemed more favorable. There was little likelihood that the metropolis, so preoccupied with domestic reform, would seriously interfere with societies 3,000 miles across the sea. The doctrine of the early revolution gave sanction to self government and the rights of private property. In November, when Saint Domingue uh, colonists became panicked by rumors that agents of the Ami de Noir were roaming the island, they threatened to follow the example of the United States if the revolution should lead to any tampering with slavery. Even the Assembly of the North Province, led by merchants and lawyers closely tied to France, repeated the warning and symbolically separated the colony's general will, quote unquote, from that of the mother country. By March 1790, separatism became more explicit in the rival assembly at St. Mark in the West Province, which drafted an unauthorized constitution and declared that the colony's internal affairs were beyond the jurisdiction of the Constituent Assembly. If these rumblings disturbed French merchants and absentee proprietors, they were also politically useful in helping to smother anti slavery rhetoric and to win constitutional autonomy for the island's domestic governance. Ordinarily, one might have expected to find the strongest anti slavery sentiment among the middle class delegates from the great port cities, where the spirit of the Enlightenment had been absorbed and had nourished a progressive, cosmopolitan, and tolerant frame of mind, often institutionalized in Masonic lodges or philanthropic societies resembling the Amis de Noir. Briseau de Warville, the founder and main publicist of the Amis de Noir, later emerged as the leader of the Girondians, who drew their name from Gironde, the province surrounding Bordeaux, and who represented both the liberal and commercial spirit of the port cities. On most of the issues of the early revolution, Brissot's natural allies were Bordelais leaders like Godet, Genson, I'm not sure how those are pronounced, and Vergniaud. Like Brissot, such men favored reforms that promised to strengthen ties between the colonies and the mother country. In Bordeaux, humanitarian fervor could even extend to the hope for an eventual emancipation of West Indian slaves. But an immediate colonial but on immediate but on immediate colonial issues, the artisans, workers, merchants, and professional men of the port cities formed a united front. Early in 1790, a delegation from Bordeaux's Armée Patriotique, giving expression to the popular will, informed the Paris Assembly and Jacobean Club that 5,000,000 men depended on colonial commerce for their livelihood, and that both the slave trade and the West Indian slavery were vital supports to national prosperity. Accordingly, until 1793, the slave trade continued to receive an official subsidy. As we have seen, the Constituent Assembly delegated West Indian affairs to a Committee on Colonies, charging it, like the Constitutional Convention's Committee of Detail, to submit a report defining constitutional powers and jurisdiction. Excuse me. Like the American Committee of Detail, the French Committee on Colonies represented both planter and commercial interests and struck a compromise intended to mollify all parties except the abolitionists. The committee, chaired by Antoine Pierre Barnave, took the risk of alienating the colonists when it endorsed the mercantilist system as, quote, an essential condition of the union of metropolis and colonies, end quote. The colonial deputies had told the Assembly that their constituents were starving because France could not supply them with sufficient quantities of grain. Barnave conceded that justice might require further modifications in the prohibitive regime, but bowing to the demands from French merchants, his committee insisted that requests for reform be submitted to the National Assembly for final decision. As compensation, however, the committee would allow the colonists the right to draft constitutions for their own internal government to be approved by the King and National Assembly. In the resolution that so pleased Sir William Young, speaking to the British Parliament, the committee disavowed any further interference with the slave trade. And finally, in a decree which all slaveholders would have liked to incorporate in their respective constitutions, the committee branded as treasonous any attempt to incite uprisings against the colonists or their property. When Mirabeau and Pétion de Villeneuve tried to speak against this measure, which they saw aimed at the Amis de Noir, the Assembly shouted them down. The Assembly adopted the proposals of Barnave's committee on March 8, 1790. On March 28th, the Amis had their first opportunity to challenge constitutional concessions that would give colonists a free hand with race relations. Although the West Indians had already begun drafting constitutions, the National Assembly presumed that it could still issue instructions governing the initial elections. The Committee on Colonies had considered granting suffrage to every citizen, quote unquote, and in one draft, quote, without exception of color, end quote, who owned sufficient property or paid taxes in his parish. But Article 4 of the instructions submitted to the Assembly said nothing of citizenship or color, referring simply to toutes les personnes, all the people. I'm not sure if that's all, but the people. In the floor debate, the Abbé Gregoire demanded that the ambiguity be resolved, adding that Arthur Dillon had assured him the phrase included free mulattoes who could meet the property qualifications. Chevalier de Cocherel, a deputy for Saint Domingue, replied that Dillon might speak as he wished for Martinique, but certainly not for Saint Domingue. Some of the West Indians favored dropping the clause altogether. Others conveyed the impression that well-to-do mulattoes already enjoyed political rights. The Assembly voted to shut off discussion, but in the confusion, many deputies interpreted the response to Gregoire's question to mean that qualified mulattoes would have the right to vote. Like the phrases quote unquote importation or migration and quote unquote such persons, toutes les personnes was ambiguous enough to satisfy the Assembly. In the West Indies, however, the white colonists had no intention either of giving the vote to mulattoes or of allowing France to set suffrage requirements. The Saint Domingue planters would change their minds about mulattoes' rights after the slaves had burned most of the estates and cane fields on the rich North Plain. But in 1790, when all the forces seemed to be working in their favor, the colonists would stand for no ambiguity about toutes les personnes. In Saint Domingue, the Petite Blanque the Little Whites, rioted against property qualifications for voting and demanded secession if any attempt were made to enfranchise the non-whites. In August, royal troops dispersed the assembly at St. Mark after it had opened the island's ports to free trade without the governor's approval. In October, Vincent Auger, a mulatto associate of the Amis de Noir, arrived in Le Cap and appealed to the authorities to enforce Article 4 of the Assembly's instructions. Professing his support for the slave system, Auger also claimed that the Assembly had intended toutes les personnes to eliminate racial disabilities. Auger did not count on the force of the principle. He had secured arms and munitions in the United States. Soon after attacking Le Cap, he and his followers were crushed, tortured, and executed. Auger's martyrdom would make him a hero in revolutionary France, as well as among the mulattoes of Saint Domingue. But meanwhile, the news of violence and insubordination had caused the Constituent Assembly to order the dissolution of the General Assemblies of Saint Domingue and Martinique. As an olive branch, the punitive decree of October 12th also promised that France would not interfere with the status of persons in the colonies. Excuse me. By the spring of 1791, there was growing support for the mulatto petitioners in France and increasing turmoil in the colonies. As royal authority disintegrated in the West Indies, it fell upon the Constituent Assembly to enforce its own authority by dispatching troops and civil commissioners. Few deputies could question the need for such action, but disputes over the commissioners' instructions brought dangerous delay and finally an agreement on open debate. It was the issue of mulatto rights that finally moved colonial affairs outside committee control. The mulatto petitioners charged the white colonists with openly violating Article 4 of the Assembly's earlier instructions. Moreau de Saint-Méry, the distinguished jurist from Martinique who had briefly governed Paris after the fall of the Bastille, bitterly attacked the Amis de Noir and warned that France must either renounce its commerce and wealth or frankly declare that the Declaration of the Rights of Man did not apply to the colonies. Defending a proposed constitution for the colonies submitted by 4 associated committees on imperial affairs, Moreau emphasized that West Indian conventions must have an unequivocal guarantee that the French National Assembly would never pass a law on the status of persons unless formally requested to do so by the colonists. This provision embodied in the proposed constitution provoked heated debate on May 13, 1791. Amendments were offered to change quote, no law on the status of persons to no law on the status of persons not free, or no law on the status of slaves. All 3 short quotes. Jean-Francois Rubel, a radical Jacobean, proposed instead, quote, persons not free other than those born of free mothers and fathers, end quote. Moreau, who reminded the Assembly of the fatal effects produced by the ambiguity of toutes personnes, it would do to speak vaguely of persons not free. The moment had arrived when it was essential to reassure the colonists with precise words which could leave no room for doubt. He then demanded that the Assembly decree as a new constitutional article that the national legislature could adopt no law, quote, on the status of slaves, end quote, except upon the formal and spontaneous request of the colonial assemblies. This was exactly the guarantee South Carolina had wanted in the United States Constitution. But Moreau's proposal played into the hands of the more extreme radicals. Like many members of the Philadelphia Convention, Robespierre objected to the dishonor of using the word slaves in a constitution. In a flaming speech, he also hinted that secret enemies of the Constitution were opposing the rights of Negroes as a means of subverting the revolution. Echoing the rhetoric of the Abbé Raynal, he declared, "Et périssant vos something about I don't know the colonies, si vous voulez to save the colonies." I think. Um, I'm not sure. There's a fairly long French um, quote here that I don't know enough of the words to even try to interpret. After hearing Robespierre's speech, Moreau announced he would not quibble over words so long as the meaning were understood, and withdrew his amendment to include slaves, the word slaves. On May 14th, the Assembly heard testimony from mulattoes on the evils of racial discrimination. Julien Raymond, the chief mulatto pamphleteer and activist, argued that granting rights to his people would help keep the slaves in their place. Like Brissot and Gregoire, the mulattoes disavowed any intention of weakening the slave system. But Vifil de Essars then offered a detailed plan for the total emancipation of all slaves over a period of 16 years, and on May 15th, despite warnings of insurrection and slaughter of the whites, the Assembly adopted by acclamation Rubel's amendment that no law would be passed on the status of persons not free other than those born of free mothers and fathers. Few mulattoes could meet this requirement, but it represented a break in the color wall. The West Indian deputies stalked out of the assembly and for a time considered returning to the colonies to promote secession and resistance. In the explanatory instructions sent to Saint Domingue, the assembly condemned slavery in principle, but acknowledged that the Declaration of the Rights of Man could not be extended to bondsmen without producing the gravest evils. However, the children of free parents, regardless of color, should enjoy the full rights of citizenship. As might be expected, the white colonists saw the proceedings of May 15th as a betrayal of the Assembly's promise of October 12, 1790. There was talk of secession and alliance with England, but the slaves themselves had not been blind to the struggles between royalists and patriots, between mulattoes and petites blancs on Oh, that was the end of the sentence, sorry. On the night of August 22nd, 1791, a pivotal date in the history of New World slavery, they began to burn and kill. The well-planned insurrection in the North Province might have settled the issue of mulattoes' rights and led to the restoration of French authority in the Caribbean. The mulattoes of St. Domingue's West Province made a show of force that soon won official approval of their demands, since the whites knew they needed mulatto support to suppress the slaves. In France, Brissot was as eager as were his Girondin friends in the new legislative assembly to send enough troops to crush the slaves, protect private property, and restore normal commercial relations with France. By late November 1791, the leaders of the rebellious slaves, including Toussaint l'Ouverture, offered to surrender to the newly arrived French commissioners if freedom were promised to a few hundred of their friends. It was only the intransigence of the Assembly at Le Cap that convinced Toussaint that his own freedom was inseparable from that of his brothers. Yet even by the following summer, when Toussaint had organized a more disciplined black army, the cause of the slaves seemed hopeless. No one could have dreamed that this aging ex-steward of livestock would soon be virtual master of the island. Meanwhile, the quickening of the French Revolution in the summer of 1791 had distracted attention from colonial affairs, further delaying the dispatch of troops. On September 23rd, a few days after the king had been forced to accept the Constitution, Barnave told the retiring constitu- Barnave told the retiring Constituent Assembly that relations with the colonies had been good until the May 15th decree had undermined confidence and led to disaster. On September 24th, the Constituent Assembly responded to Barnave's plea and tried to backtrack again, renouncing jurisdiction over the status of persons in the colonies. The Assembly was unaware that the mulattoes of St. Domingue had already made an alliance with the wealthier whites and would soon sign a concordat guaranteeing their rights. The news of the Assembly's action aggravated the conflict between the mulattoes and Petits Blancs. In the West Province, where the mulattoes felt betrayed and launched a war of racial vengeance, they themselves aroused the slaves to insurrection. In the South Province, the outnumbered whites armed their slaves against the mulattoes. Barnave had blamed the insurrections on the May 15th decree and on the agitation of the Amis de Noir. The Amis replied that many colonists were guilty of treason and had precipitated violence as a pretext for English intervention. Even French merchants had second thoughts when they learned that St. Domingue planters had appealed for aid from the governor of Jamaica. By December 1st, 1791, the new Legislative Assembly could no longer ignore the colonial crisis. Briseau, an influential member, had threatened to make his own report if none were forthcoming from the Colonial Committee. Now he delivered an eloquent speech demanding repeal of the September 24th law and warning that slaves could be kept at work only if their natural guardians, the mulattoes, were kept content. The strengthened political voice of the Amis de Noir provoked pro-slavery speeches that rivaled those of the first United States Congress. But the collapse of the conservative Feuillants and the rise to power of the Girondins made it easier to repudiate earlier constitutional guarantees. In the spring of 1792, the Legislative Assembly nullified the previous nullification of September 24th. So they nullified the nullification. Okay. Uh, they nullified the previous nullification of September 24th and, overriding the precedents of the Constituent Assembly, proclaimed equal rights to all free Negroes and mulattoes, whose support now appeared essential for the colony's pacification and defense. By September 1792, events in France had moved at such a rapid pace that any colonial response could only be hopelessly out of phase. Having first been assured a degree of constitutional autonomy, the white colonists faced in September a French army of 6,000 troops, many of them imbued with Jacobean principles, led by 3 Girondin-appointed commissioners carrying dictatorial powers. The most influential commissioner, Laguerre Félicité Sontena, yeah, whatever, was in effect an agent of Brissot's. The latter's ascendancy to the Legislative Assembly appeared to ensure military enforcement of the racial policies of the Amis de Noir. These policies now drew increasing support from merchants ready to seek mulatto allies in order to subdue the slaves and prevent white planters from delivering the colony to England. But the Amis, in this moment of triumph, had ceased to exist. Brissot had become preoccupied with a European war of liberation, quote unquote, and with preventing the French Revolution from becoming more radical. He had denounced Lafayette and the more conservative Amis de Noir as enemies of the state. He and the Girondins were increasingly regarded as counter-revolutionary traitors by Robespierre, the Mountain, and the Sans-Culottes. Um, the Mountain included radical but pro-slavery planters who joined Robespierre in accusing Brissot of plotting to destroy the colonies or ready them for English seizure. The so-called Second Revolution, beginning with the storming of the Tuileries and the calling of the National Convention, undermined the power of the Girondins. In November 1792, the Jacobin Club expelled Brissot and the Girondin commissioners. The convention demanded that the latter return to France, but the order went unheeded. In response to these events, the Saint-Domingue planters began fighting the commissioners in the name of the deposed French king and with the support of mulatto troops. The planters collaborated with invading Spanish and then English armies. The French army, sent to suppress the slaves, thus became engaged in suppressing royalist whites and fighting foreign enemies. When, I'm just going to say Sonthonax, because that's what it looks like. I know it's wrong. Hey, Meneth, how are you? Says Vesper. I am good. You asked a question earlier about where was I on Tuesday. I read on Tuesday. It was Wednesday that I missed, which was the Star Wars reading. But I actually did read on Tuesday. I don't know where you were. Okay, when Sonthonax faced annihilation after being driven by royalists out of Le Cap, he promised pardon and freedom to the slaves surrounding the city, who then took the opportunity to destroy the city and send the terrorized inhabitants fleeing to the United States. For a time, however, Toussaint and other black leaders wisely sided with the invading Spanish and claimed to fight for the crown of France. It was essential for the slaves to exploit the division of their enemies, since the revolutionary government of France promised no more than political rights for mulattoes, and a planter-English alliance pointed to a restoration of the old regime. Then on August 29, 1793, shortly after the planters welcomed a British expeditionary force from Jamaica, Sonthonax played his last card and decreed the emancipation of the slaves. Britain and the United States after 1792 offer no parallels to the French experience with slavery. One can hardly imagine a scene in Parliament or Congress like the one in the French Convention on June 4, 1793, when the President warmly greeted a manumitted Negro woman who was reputedly 114 years old. Martial music celebrated the arrival of colored delegates from Saint Domingue and the Abbé Gregoire, who had risen to power in the new convention, expressed an ardent hope for the total abolition of slavery. But though Gregoire succeeded in abolishing the bounty to slave traders, the government still refused to end the trade itself. When the convention finally enacted universal emancipation on February 4, 1794, it was not because of anti-slavery agitation. In Saint Domingue, the blacks had gone far toward freeing themselves and had proved that they alone could save the colonies from English conquest. Indeed, the Emancipation Decree arrived too late to save Martinique from capture. By February 1794, the leading abolitionists had either fled France or been guillotined like Brissot, along with Arthur Dillon and most of the defenders of colonial slavery. The convention was so out of touch with West Indian affairs that René Levasseur expressed astonishment when three delegates from Saint Domingue, including one black and one mulatto, reported that there were still slaves in the French Caribbean. Levaucheur's Levaucheur's demand for immediate emancipation won enthusiastic acclaim. Danton, soon to be executed himself, predicted that future generations would find their glory in this decree of universal liberty. On 30 Pleuvois, year 2 of the Republic, the French celebrated the event in Notre Dame, now the Temple of Reason. Anaxagoras Chaumette, I'm not sure how you would pronounce that in French, um, Chaumette, but not the other one. The Attorney General of Paris embraced colored citizens. Someone raised a Negro child high in the air as the drums rolled and the soldiers marched. With tears in their eyes, the people lifted the arms of the colored citizens and shouted, Vive la République! Vive la France! 8 years later, Napoleon Bonaparte would resolve to re-enslave colonial Negroes and would send an army to crush Toussaint L'Ouverture. Expansion and constraint. As we have seen, slavery proved to be a dangerously divisive issue in the assemblies of Britain, France, and the United States. The premises of anti-slavery philosophy were much the same in the three countries, but acquired quite different implications when adapted to the interests of a Wilberforce, a Brissot, or a Gouverneur Morris. Slaveholders shared a common determination to resist the slightest infringements on their property rights, even if this required renouncing allegiance to a national government. Yet the secessionist impulse was credible only in the United States, where Southern delegates represented a substantial white population capable of fending for itself. Excuse me. In Britain and France, the planter class drew temporary support from alliances with commercial interests, particularly those connected with the African trade. By 1787, New England's commercial interests were not sufficiently tied to the slave trade, but they saw the Deep South sufficient reinforcement. They gave this Deep South sufficient reinforcement to postpone prohibition and to gain an implicit constitutional sanction for slavery. The various alliances between planters and merchants involved more than advantageous trade-offs. They rested on a common respect for the rights of property and a common fear of genuine revolution, especially after the slaves of St. Domingue had dramatized the meaning of revolution. In the 1790s, the assemblies of all three countries styled themselves as temples of liberty, but tried to reassure planters by issuing formal statements denying or relinquishing any power to alter the status of slaves. Excuse me. Yet controversy continued over the precise limits of governmental jurisdiction. If the United States Constitution gave slaveholders important protections, it could also be interpreted as granting Congress powers that were broad and flexible enough to ensure eventual emancipation throughout the nation. The significant point is that the South's social structure provided the political strength to block undesirable legislation. In contrast, British planters had to rely on the inertia and conservatism of the metropolitan social order, whose preservation might for a time be linked to the well-being of the old colonial system, but might ultimately depend on the social order's own adaptability to middle-class reforms. The loser British the looser the looser British Constitution provided slaveholders little protection from future encroachments as their economic power waned. French planters, like their British counterparts, relied less on the populousness of the colonies than on their economic importance to the mother country. But like the North American slaveholders, the French colonists sought to exploit a revolutionary situation in order to gain a degree of autonomy and fixed guarantees protecting their property. The National Assembly's vacillation in defining its jurisdiction over the status of mulattoes brought a loss of confidence which aggravated separatist impulses and fostered internal conflicts within the colonies. The relative stability and continuity of the British and American governments enabled British and American slavery to survive the age of revolution. But the institution itself proved too unstable to survive the extreme discontinuities of the French Revolution. It would appear, then, that while the political response to slavery followed roughly similar patterns in Britain, France, and the United States, the crucial differences arose from the opportunities available to the slaveholding classes and from the constitutional structures that defined their rights and ultimate power. These conclusions may gain added meaning if we glance briefly at subsequent efforts to promote or contain the expansion of Negro slavery. After 1800, French policy made it clear that the Emancipation Proclamation of 1794 had been an aberration signifying neither the growth of powerful anti-slavery opinion nor the emergence of a capitalist class bent on universalizing the benefits of free labor. By the Peace of Amiens in 1802, the principal question for France was whether something could be salvaged from the wreckage of her West Indian colonies. Inspired by grandiose visions of a new American tropical empire, Napoleon had already pressured Spain into secretly ceding Louisiana to France. As soon as preliminary peace arrangements had been signed, he sent a great armada and more than 20,000 men to restore French authority in the Caribbean. For Napoleon, there was to be no further nonsense about colonial constitutions extending the universal principles of the French Revolution. In 1801, Toussaint L'Ouverture had published a constitution for St. Domingue, which not only prohibited slavery forever and made himself governor for life, but combined an allegiance to France with a denial of French authority to govern the island. Napoleon's plan called for a period of seeming conciliation, during which black and mulatto leaders would be arrested and deported to France. After the unruly masses had been subdued, they would be re-enslaved and the African trade would be restored. French troops overwhelmed the rebels of Guadeloupe, where Victor Hughes, after defeating the English with a racially mixed army, had carried out the earlier emancipation decree under a dictatorial regime. Martinique presented few problems since the island had been held in trust, as it were, by the British. During the later Napoleonic Wars, the British would again seize Martinique and Guadeloupe, ensuring the further stability of their slave systems until such time as the colonies would finally be restored to Bourbon France. The British had failed, however, to wrest St. Domingue from the mulattoes and the emancipated blacks who had fought alongside the French Republican armies. By 1800, Toussaint had slowly eliminated white power in St. Domingue. He had also tried to reassure white settlers of his own goodwill and of his dependence on France, assuming that France made no attempt to reinstitute the old colonial regime. Toussaint's faith in compromise, unfortunately for him, helped to divide his followers and ultimately led to his capture. Only a few black leaders like Jean-Jacques Dessalines recognized that French promises were as temporary as the convention's decree of universal emancipation, although the truth became clear when news arrived from Guadeloupe that both slavery and the color line had been reestablished. As for St. Domingue, as a result of the heroic resistance of black and mulatto troops, aided in the end by yellow fever, Napoleon's generals were not able to subdue the island before their resumption of war with England cut off both supplies and retreat. The triumph of Dessalines, the ex-slave founder of Haiti, makes it impossible to know what questions of jurisdiction might have been raised by the expansion of French slavery in the New World. The French Revolution had opened the way for the destruction of the world's richest slave colony and for the first large-scale emancipation. The ensuing reaction stifled all further attempts at reform. At the end of the Napoleonic period, there was little French protest against the reopening of the African slave trade. With no opportunity for expansion, slavery would nevertheless persist in the remaining French colonies until the Revolution of 1848. The United States had been closely involved with the fate of St. Domingue. The American Revolution had not only opened the way for a brisk trade that supported the sugar boom of the 1780s, but had given military experience to St. Domingue mulattoes fighting with the French armies. In the late 1790s, during the undeclared naval war with France, American ships supplied and openly aided Toussaint. It is doubtful whether Haitian independence could have been achieved without American arms and provisions, although in 1803 American opportunism also helped supply Napoleon's troops. Under growing pressure from France, the United States finally placed an embargo in 1806 on commerce from the rebellious Black Republic, whose continuing survival threatened the security of all slaveholding regimes. By then, however, there was no danger that France would colonize Louisiana as a supplier of provisions for her tropical empire. France's abandonment of Louisiana forced the United States to confront questions of governmental sanction and jurisdiction in their clearest terms. The central issue, as William L. Yancey later told the Democratic Party at its stormy convention in April 1860, was whether the Constitution framed to protect minorities could prevent the government from discriminating against slaveholders in the competitive settlement of the West. Yancey's position, which drew support from the Dred Scott decision, was that slaves should be accorded the same status as other kinds of property. To bar them from any part of the public domain was invidious injustice and a violation of fundamental law. There is no need to review the complex history of this problem except to identify the major contrasts between French, American, and British experience. By the 1780s, the populations of the North and South were roughly equal, and there was a general expectation that migration would move on latitudinal lines, extending westward the customs and institutions of the seaboard states. 7 of the original states had legal claims on much of the Trans-Appalachian territory. To many Northerners, it seemed only natural that Kentucky, which had long been an extension of Virginia, should be admitted as a new slave state in 1792. At that time, neither New York nor New Jersey had taken steps to abolish slavery, and even Pennsylvania's Emancipation Act had not yet freed a single Negro. When North Carolina and Georgia finally ceded their western lands to the federal government, it was with the stipulation that slavery be permitted in the relinquished territories. In 1790, Congress omitted any mention of slavery when it enacted provisions for the territorial government of the Southwest. We do not know precisely why Southern representatives in the Continental Congress accepted the clause in the ordinance of 1787 prohibiting slavery from the territory north of the Ohio River. Earlier proposals to exclude slavery from all the territories had had no chance of success and do not indicate, as has sometimes been alleged, any realistic expectation that the institution could be confined to the original states. Perhaps Stoughton Lynd is right in suspecting a wow. He has sorry, there's a very, very long note here that takes up literally a page and a half. Perhaps Stoughton Lynd is right in suspecting a secret bargain in which the North won exclusion of slavery from the Northwest as the price for the three-fifths clause in the Constitution, which the convention adopted the day before Congress agreed to the anti-slavery ordinance. The South would have had still other motives for such an agreement. The Northwest Ordinance tacitly implied that there would be no opposition to the extension of slavery south of the Ohio. In general, Southerners had good reason for believing they would benefit from rapid settlement of the West, even if legislative encouragement required a moral concession to those who feared an agricultural alliance against northeastern commerce. If the federal government succeeded in protecting American commercial rights in Spanish New Orleans, planters could count on the Mississippi River system to knit the Trans-Appalachian area into a cohesive economic unit. On the other hand, the Northwest Ordinance, which the new Congress reenacted, set a precedent for barring slavery from prescribed areas. Some qualifications should be added to the current view of the South as initially committed to the westward expansion of slavery and the aggrandizement of political power. In 1787, no one could foresee the importance of cotton cultivation or anticipate that the American slave population would increase by more than 1 million in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. In both England and America, abolitionists contended that ending the slave trade would reduce the density of slave populations and permit various ameliorative reforms. In 1798, when Congress debated a motion to extend the Southwest Exclusion Clause to Mississippi Territory, William Giles expressed a common variant on this thesis. Quote, if the slaves of the southern states were permitted to go into this western country by lessening the number in those states and spreading them over a large surface of country, there would be a greater probability of ameliorating their condition, which could never be done whilst they were crowded together as they now are in the southern states. End quote. However credible in 1798, this notion was far less convincing by 1804, when various senators voiced alarm over the increases in slaves shown by the censuses of 1790 and 1800. In 1798, however, there were no official statistics to contradict the widespread assumption that Georgia's prohibition of further slave importations could result in a relatively stable Negro population. Nevertheless, even in 1798, some Southern congressmen made it clear that on the question of slavery in the territories, two philosophies were at war. They could not tolerate any provision that would restrict the Southwest to settlers who brought no slaves. Even Albert Gallatin, who argued that Congress had a perfect right to prohibit a practice that would be detrimental in the long run to the happiness of the people, acknowledged that present settlers who had arrived under the laws of England, Spain, or Georgia could not with justice be deprived of their property. And if Congress could not interfere with the slave property already brought into a given territory, how could it prevent future settlers from moving in with their bondsmen? This question would confound American politics for 2 generations to come. But the first crisis arose in 1804 as a result of the collapse of French power in the Caribbean. As we shall see in a moment, the same circumstance presented England with a similar problem and a similar turning point, but with consequences vastly different. Unlike the territories east of the Mississippi, Louisiana was free from the land claims of seaboard states and was beyond the reach of the ordinances that had made the Ohio River a dividing line between supposedly free and slave soil. President Jefferson's purchase of the immense and uncharted territory claimed by France, which doubled the area of the United States, raised constitutional issues never contemplated by the Convention of 1787. Theoretically, since the Constitution granted Congress the power, quote, to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States, end quote, Louisiana might have been governed for a time as a kind of crown colony, where experiments with labor reform could have served as a yardstick for the existing states. The Senate, in fact, insisted that the territorial legislature be appointed by the president and not elected by the inhabitants, in the belief that the inhabitants had had no training in self government. On the other hand, the Treaty of Purchase guaranteed the white inhabitants equal citizenship, recognized their titles to slave property under French and Spanish law, and promised early admission to the Union. Louisiana contained in 1803 more than 16,000 slaves. The number had been considerably augmented by refugees from the French Caribbean who had greatly stimulated Louisiana's production of sugar. No one seriously challenged the government's right to exclude new slaves from Louisiana, although Northeastern Federalists did challenge the wisdom and constitutionality of the purchase. No one seriously questioned the right of present inhabitants to retain their slaves, but the fear of black rebels from the French Caribbean brought overwhelming support for Senator James Hillhouse's motion to prohibit foreign slaves from being imported into Louisiana. In response to South Carolina's reopening of the African trade, the Senate also agreed to Hillhouse's proposal to exclude all Negroes who had been brought into the United States since 1798, at which time Georgia had stopped legal importation. It is remarkable, in view of the South's adamant stand in 1807, that the Senate decided that slaves illicitly taken to Louisiana should be freed. This measure may also have been a slap at South Carolina, whose senators were not present for the vote. Even many Northerners thought that Hillhouse went too far, however, when he then moved that no slave brought into Louisiana in the future could be sold or held in servitude for more than 1 year. Congress had received strong memorials against the expansion of slavery into Louisiana. Leaders from all sections were aware of the issue's broad significance, but Hillhouse, as a Connecticut Federalist, was subject to the suspicion of trying to impede the growth of the West. Other Northern Federalists thought it unwise to risk an explosive debate on slavery. Stephen Bradley, the Vermont Republican, who would sponsor the 1807 law prohibited the slave trade, said he had done everything in his power to keep the question from being raised. Bradley assured the Senate he considered slavery, quote, as a moral evil, as a violation of the laws of God, of nature, of Vermont, end quote. And even quoted Exodus on man-stealers deserving to die, but he voted along with both senators from Massachusetts with the South. In the end, the Senate accepted Hillhouse's compromise proposal to restrict the importation of slaves to the bona fide property of actual settlers. Though opposed by Virginia, this measure drew support from South Carolina and Georgia, both of which had enacted similar regulations to avoid becoming a dumping ground for Virginia's unruly blacks. If we are to see the law in perspective, we should remember that most of the slaves who moved westward did so with their masters. In any event, the law was unenforceable and was soon interpreted to mean that South Carolinians could bring in slaves who had recently arrived from Africa. In effect, then, slavery could expand into Louisiana as freely as into Mississippi. This decision was the logical outcome of two premises the government had long accepted, that slaves were legitimate property and that territories, being an extension of the nation, should be equally open to all citizens. If the Northwest Ordinance contradicted the last premise, there would soon be strong pressure for the ordinance's suspension in Indiana, where in 1807 the territorial legislature concocted a legal subterfuge to attract the settlement of slaveholders. Although pro-slavery movements ultimately failed in Indiana and Illinois, it was evident well before the Missouri crisis that slavery would not only be permitted to expand westward, enjoying the same protections it had in the original southern states, but that it would become the key to the sectional balance of power. I think we're getting pretty close to the end here. And that's good because I'm out of water. As we have suggested, uh, there's a typo there. French defeats in the Caribbean presented Britain with a very similar problems. It was imperative to prevent black revolution from spreading to Jamaica and the other established colonies. Military conquest opened enormous areas of virgin land, especially in Trinidad and the former Dutch colonies on the Guyana coast. Having acquired considerable experience in imperial management, Britain denied the newly won colonies any right to legislative self-government. In the interest of security and centralized control, the crown colonies of Trinidad, St. Lucia, Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice were to be governed directly by orders in council, administered by royal governors and nominated councils which the governors could overrule, with the exception of Tobago, which had the precedent of English representative government. The new territories joined the empire on a completely different footing from that of the older sugar colonies. In 1805, William Pitt, the Prime Minister, took action somewhat similar to that of the United States regarding Louisiana. An order in council prohibited the importation of foreign slaves into the captured or ceded colonies and restricted the annual introduction of any slaves to 3% of the existing slave populations. At first, the older colonies stood to gain by this discrimination. The prohibition of the African slave trade to the captured colonies gave a competitive advantage to land-hungry planters in the older islands who wished to migrate with their blacks to the frontier lands. Accordingly, the internal Caribbean slave trade could bring rich profits, although the older colonies soon began to fear overproduction of tropical staples and a fatal reduction in the price of sugar. Moreover, Britain, unlike the United States, successfully restricted the intercolonial traffic so that only in Trinidad and there for a brief period did the inflow check the general decline in slave population after 1817. In Trinidad, the labor shortage grew so acute that some planters turned to Chinese immigrants or even to free blacks who had served in the imperial armies or been taken from America in the War of 1812. An equally serious threat appeared when anti-slavery leaders persuaded Spencer Perceval's ministry to use the crown colonies as models for social experimentation. The West Indian legislatures had always conceded Parliament's right to regulate imperial trade, but had insisted on their own constitutional jurisdiction over internal affairs. The Crown Colonies, however, could not appeal to such arguments. In 1812, the planters of Trinidad expressed outrage when they received an order in council requiring the registration of all slaves and stipulating that in the future any unregistered Negro would be presumed to be free. Excuse me. The jurisdiction, I'm sorry, the very different word. The justification for the order fell within the realm of regulating commerce. To prevent the illegal importation of Negroes, it was argued There had to be accurate records of all existing slaves. Yet, as the West Indian planters clearly saw, a centrally administered registration would publicize statistics on slave mortality and provide the mechanism for government intervention and a wide variety of reforms. In 1815, when Wilberforce introduced a bill in the Commons for the registration of all slaves in the legislative colonies, the West Indian assemblies desperately appealed to the Crown, warning that their constitutional liberties were in jeopardy, reminding Parliament of its resolution of 1778 renouncing any further attempt to levy direct taxes on the colonies. They pointed to the fees that would be required by the legislation bill and hinted that the United States had rebelled against similar acts of despotism. But given the lesson of St. Domingue and the declining white population of the West Indies, British officials knew that secession was an empty threat. Are we there yet? Okay. Empty threats. The abolitionists who had won the ear of the government argued that it was impossible to separate the power of regulating trade as expressed in the slave trade abolition law of 1807 from the internal regulations required for the law's enforcement. In 1824, Chief Justice John Marshall would point to a similar conclusion that he defined the power of Congress to regulate commerce among the several states as a power, quote, not to be confined by state lines, but which acts upon its subject matter wherever it is to be found, end quote. As we have seen, the Senate had presumed in 1804 that the federal government could free slaves who had been illicitly imported into Louisiana, but given the strength of the South in the federal government, slaveholders had little reason to fear administrative encroachments at the hands of a hostile power. Indeed, in 1820, a congressman from Georgia even proposed a national registry of slaves as a means of preventing illegal importation, although John Randolph thought that the plan would dangerously enhance the powers of the central government. The Georgian apparently assumed that a national registry would be no more dangerous than a registry controlled by Georgia. Britain's parliament had no intention of abandoning the imperial supremacy it had announced in the Declaratory Act of 1766. But the stormy debates over the registration bill of 1815 may have encouraged the slaves of Barbados to take matters into their own hands, since early the next year they burned many plantations and laid the cane fields as bare and black as those of St. Domingue's North Plain. In response, Lord Bathurst, the colonial secretary, persuaded Wilberforce to withdraw his bill in order to give the West Indian legislatures an opportunity to save face by enacting registration laws of their own. The history of British slavery from 1816 to 1833 proved Bathurst's hopes to be wrong. The West Indian legislatures drafted ineffective registration laws, which were, of course, administered by slaveholding colonists. By 1823, anti-slavery leaders saw the necessity for Parliament's direct reform of the colonial slave codes in order to prepare the way for gradual emancipation. Bathurst followed the previous strategy of recommending to the colonies specific ameliorative measures which had been endorsed in principle by the House of Commons. In 1824, the government reinforced attempts at persuasion by an order in council designed to make Trinidad's slave code a model for the other colonies to follow. Again, West Indian assemblies talked of parliamentary despotism, constitutional liberties, and the possibility of rebellion. But even with the leverage of the crown colony system and the doctrine of reserved transcendent power, the British government failed to pressure the slaveholding colonists into adopting meaningful reforms. When emancipation came, it was an act of coercive power, of sheer parliamentary supremacy, softened, to be sure, by the award of monetary compensation. By 1833, the West Indians had been virtually stripped of indirect representation in Parliament, and their defeat signaled the eventual end of their own representative institutions. If any broad conclusion can be drawn from the British experience, it is that plantation slavery, even when declining economically, could not be ameliorated or gradually abolished by indirect means. Yet two striking achievements may in part be credited to the British policy of recommendation, warning, and example. First, in contrast to the United States, Britain successfully limited the growth of slavery in the frontier lands of Trinidad and Guiana, though at the expense of the colony's economic development. The Crown Colony system encouraged both planters and statesmen to look to Asia and Africa for cheap sources of nominally free labor, but it also reduced the relative political power of the West Indian colonies. Hence, the growth of the plantation labor force could not have the divisive consequences, even on a minor scale, that it had in the United States. Second, because of the gradual weakening of the white power structure in the West Indies, the British government could support the demands of the free colored population, using the crown colonies as models for removing legal barriers of discrimination. This achievement meant that before the slaves had been emancipated, Britain had moved far toward resolving the problem that had destroyed French authority in Saint Domingue. In retrospect, it appears that a few radical abolitionists had more insight into the nature and tendencies of slavery than did the Pitts and Jeffersons, who expressed confidence that gradual progress would obviate the need for decisive national action. From any realistic viewpoint, to be sure, it was clear that in the period from 1770 to 1820, abolitionists had little chance of persuading any of national governments that uh, the three national governments to take the direct and forceful action necessary to remedy the injustices of Negro slavery. Yet abolitionist doctrine had helped to fuse conflicts in value with specific conflicts of interest, making slavery a testing ground for disputes over representation, jurisdiction, and the limitation of power. If there had been no abolitionists, the injustices of slavery, which mankind had tolerated for several millennia, would hardly have seemed a serious problem. And that is the end of that chapter, chapter 3. So, next time we'll pick up chapter 4, and hopefully it's not as long. Let me just check real quick. Um, it's another fairly long one. We'll just have to see. I'll do my best to get through it in one night, but I might have to split it in half too. Um, I know some people think, geez, you can't even get through one chapter. It isn't the fact that I can't read it, it's that my voice gives out. If you've never read out loud for an extended period of time, you have no idea. Oh, anyway, that will be that for tonight. Let me see who's around. Oh, we've got Mr. Blitzer playing Hogwarts Legacy. That's a good game. I've played it. Let's see. Anybody else on? We've got Hot Dog Raw Dog playing Sonic. I think I'd rather go watch some Hogwarts Legacy, to be honest. So I think that is what I will do. I'll take us on over there. So bear with me. Give him a couple minutes of your time, if you would, please. Um, even say hi. And I will get us on over there. See you in a minute. Looking for Mr. Blitzer. There he be.